If you weren't here last Sunday, Johnny introduced me as a guest speaker. If you don't know me, I have the privilege of serving as senior pastor of Crossbridge Church, and I was here since the first day that this campus launched 14 years ago. But I still like to be introduced as a guest because that means that there are always new people coming in through these doors, and I love this campus. I hope you've been having a great Sunday so far, a great overcast Sunday. I've been having a great Sunday. As a matter of fact, my day kicked off over at our Key Biscayne campus, where we had the opportunity and the privilege to baptize about 17 people this morning. It's amazing. I think there's a picture. Is there a picture, Johnny? But you know, here's what's interesting. A month ago, just actually less than a month ago, we held an all-campus baptism, and there were some folks from Key Biscayne that were baptized on that Saturday. A lot of them were traveling, and they did not want to go into the summer because a lot of Key Biscayners just travel to South America during the summer without being baptized. And we thought that initially there was going to be like 5 or 6 people. But then as they learned that we were going to hold baptisms on that Sunday or this Sunday morning, more and more people started to come out of the woods and say, hey, I really want to be baptized. And we began to sit down with these folks the last couple of weeks and hear some of the most amazing stories of what God is doing in the lives of the people of that campus. And to me, it was so refreshing. And moments like these are so refreshing because, as pastors and leaders, you got to know this because this is what Johnny and Pastor Carter do here at Brickell. You just, lower your head and you plug it away. You're just working and laboring hard for the kingdom. And sometimes it's hard for you to notice and see what God is really doing in the life of the church. And then moments like these, like this morning, whole families were being baptized. Husbands and wives, mothers and daughters. I mean, we had Gen Xers, we had millennials, we had Gen Zs, we even had alphas that were being baptized today. And the only thing that you hear as all of that is happening and taking place is, hey, I just want you to know, this is God speaking, I'm at work. I'm at work. I'm at work. We started this series of sermons in the book of Ruth a couple weeks back. And this has been an amazing journey so far in the book of Ruth. We're right at the middle of the story. This is episode 4. And I think that what this chapter does is it allows us to see God at work. It's an amazing glimpse into the providence of God and to see God's hands all over the lives of these people in this story. And therefore, my hope as we go through this text tonight is that as you have come into this room, maybe discouraged about an aspect of your life where you feel alone and abandoned, that as we go through this passage together tonight, that you will have a glimpse of God also working in your life. And so we find ourselves in chapter 3, and we will read verses 1 through 13. It's the shortest chapter of the book. I'll refer to the later verses, but for tonight, we're going to do 1 through 13. And if you don't have a text in front of you, a Bible in front of you, I have a copy of the book of Ruth for you to see how little this book is. The passage is going to be printed on the screen behind me. It's what the Word of God says. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that I may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" She answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Hear that, young ladies? "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." This is the word of the Lord. There are four very important truths that we are reminded tonight that remind us of the theme of the sermon, which is a theme of God's providence. Many have asked, what is God's providence? God's providence is when God uses the natural circumstances to accomplish his supernatural will. And so what do we learn about that here today? First, we learn that God is at work. Secondly, we learn that God works through us. Thirdly, that God works despite us. And then lastly, we find the motivation for God's work. God works out of love. Let's look at these four pieces of truth tonight. First, God is at work. We've been saying since last week, I don't know if you were here last week, but this is one of those books in the Bible where sometimes it's hard to perceive God's actions in the lives of the characters. But even though God may seem hidden, we learn here in the text that he is never absent. Ruth ends up working in the fields of this man by the name of Boaz. As you remember and recall the story, these two ladies move from the land of Moab to the town of Bethlehem, where the oldest one of them, a woman by the name of Naomi, was from. She had left 10 years prior to that with her husband and her two sons, and while in Moab, all the men died. Her two sons die after they had married two different women. Not each, but each of them had married a woman. And when they return now to Bethlehem, now you have one of the daughters-in-law, and you also have Naomi. And now they have a big problem because they are widows, they have no prospect of a future, and they must restart their lives. And what they decide to do is Naomi stays home because she is the oldest one, while Ruth goes out into the fields and gleans from the crops in order to bring food home to feed her and her mother-in-law. And she ends up in this man's field by the name of Boaz, who turns out is a family member of Naomi and of Ruth's dead husband. And when he finally learns that those women are family of his, he gives them protection, he gives them kindness, he offers them provision. And what we said also last week is that this is no coincidence, that the reason why she ends up in Boaz's field is not out of coincidence, but it's an indication that God had been at work in their story and in their life. You and I go through moments in life where it's hard to perceive God's actions and God's work in our lives. And oftentimes we have wondered, is God really here? Is he at work? I remember when we had our first child. I don't know those young parents who are in the room, if you've ever been through that, or if you've been a parent for a long time, but maybe remember that first experience of being a parent. You are obsessed with that little baby, and you're very concerned about their well-being. And they sleep in blocks of 3 hours, and they wake up, and you have to wake up in the middle of the night. I know there's some pregnant moms here and dads, and I just want to tell you this, that once that baby is born, you got to kiss your sleeping goodbye. But then there's that shocking moment, which is that first night that that baby goes to sleep for 8 hours. And you wake up in the morning, and you're like, is the baby alive? And you go into their room, and you put your ear into their chest. And you're like, oh, it's still beating. Oh, we're good. Yay, I hope this continues, right? That's how it works. You know, oftentimes in life, we take the silence as absence. We say that just because there's silence, the music has stopped, and just because there's silence, it doesn't mean that the music has stopped. If you are a Beatles fan, there's that famous song by the Beatles, A Day in the Life. How many of you heard that song? Oh, Phil, of course. Well, I don't know, Phil, if you remember, how this song goes, but there's this amazing orchestra crescendo in the middle of the song, and then there's a pause. It's a 5-second pause. And if you don't know the song, you're already skipping to the next track, right? But if you know the song, you say, no, this is part of the music. And the music returns. Just because there is silence, it does not mean that the music has stopped. God is at work. And when he's at work, he is bringing all things, the good and the bad, in order to accomplish his will. In this story, he is taking their pain and also their joys and weaving all of that together in order to accomplish his present salvation so that these women could have their needs met and survive, but also ultimately, as we see here in the book, to accomplish his ultimate salvation, because that becomes part of the lineage by which the Messiah comes into the world. That fits really well into that verse that is so well known for most of us here, Romans 8:28, where the Apostle Paul reminds us that God is working all things for good for the ones that love him. I was reminded of this verse this week while having a conversation with one of the couples that was going to be baptized today. And obviously my first question every time I'm meeting someone new, especially someone that's taking that step of faith, is, what brought you here? The wife immediately told me that they came to Miami during the pandemic. They moved from up north. And that a friend of hers in Key Biscayne invited her to church, and she started coming to church, and then she never stopped coming. And somewhere within a year of her attendance, she comes to faith, but had never been baptized. And I asked her husband, has that been the case for you as well? He says, no. I've only started coming about 8 months ago. That's usually how it works, by the way. The women always come first. And I said, well, then what did bring you to church? And he says, I have a story. I said, what's your story? He says, I was flying down to Miami after we decided that we were going to permanently move to Miami. And I was very uncomfortable on that flight because I don't like flying. And someone stands up in the middle of the flight and opens the cabinet above me. Here are the lights again. And as soon as that person opened the cabinet above me, a suitcase slipped and fell on my head and cut me at the top of my head. And I started bleeding, and I was obviously very angry that someone would do that in the middle of the flight. And I made it all the way to Miami, still angry at that person. And he says, but what was strange was that the weeks went by and the months went by and that cut did not heal. And we were at this pool party one day because my wife had become friends with this woman who is one of the leading dermatologists here in Miami. And she looked at my foot and she said, hey, I see a spot in your foot. Do you mind coming to my office on Monday? I would like to take a look at that. I showed up at the office and she put it under a microscope and she told me, hey, I don't see anything wrong with this. You can go home. That's fine. And as I was leaving, I said to her, hey, I have this cut in my head that's been in my head for 8 months and it has not healed yet. She says, come on in. She checks and she says, look, I haven't conducted a biopsy yet, but I'm 99% sure that this is a melanoma cancer. And it's big. And therefore, she went immediately and called this surgeon, friend of hers that is always very, very busy, who was able to take him just 3 or 4 days later where he conducted the surgery. When he opened up, there was a lot of stuff underneath his scalp. He said as he came out of the surgery saying, hey, had that suitcase not fallen on my head, I probably would have died and not known what caused my death. So that's why I'm at church. I was convinced that God was at work in the life of my family, and I had to come to church. We all go through moments in life as we question. Maybe you're here tonight and you're a single person and you're asking yourself, will God have someone prepared for me that I can share a life in the future? Is he at work? I don't see him at work. He's not sending anything my way. Maybe you are transitioning a job. You have been laid off or you left because you had enough and you're asking yourself, does God care about my professional life? Could there be a job out there that I would be able to use my skills and love what I do at the same time? Maybe right now you are going through a bit of a crisis caused by a moment of pain or a traumatic experience. And could it be that God has allowed you to go through what you're going through right now because he has been preventing you from going through something worse? With this text and this story, and every single story of the Bible reminds us, is that God is at work. So be encouraged, even when it seems that he's not. Secondly, we learn here in the story that God works through us. God is working through you, the main way by which God works in the world is through people. There's no mysterious force that's unleashed and brings people together. God is working with people to reconcile all things back to himself, to reconcile people to people. The natural world, fallen natural world, back into his purposes and his plans, to reconcile our future to his eternal future. But God really works through people. That's the main means by which God is at work in the world. And it's an important thing that we must acknowledge, because you are the agent of God's work in this world, in the lives of others, in the life of your community, in the life of your church. You are God's agent, and God has placed people in your life to be his hands, to be his voice, to be his comforting shoulders for you when you need and you're crying, to dry your tears. Now, these women, they understand the situation. And so what we learn here is that they devise a plan. They're back. They need to restart. We need to start to work. And they start to work. They meet this wonderful man by the name of Boaz. But what's interesting here, after chapter 2, I don't know if you've had the chance to read this book, between the last verse of chapter 2 and the first verse of chapter 3, there is a gap. Let me read the last verse of chapter 3, right? So Boaz shows great kindness to Ruth, is able to provide for her. She takes a lot of food home. But then, this is what we read in verse 23 of chapter 2. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, so she keeps doing what Boaz instructed her to do so that she would stay safe, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. This is almost like at the end of a story, right? Then she lived with her mother-in-law after she finished working the whole harvest season. Where's Boaz? She goes back home. Hey, did anyone from the town ever tell you what happened to Boaz? Did he ever ask about me again? It's kind of like what you girls sometimes feel when you go on a date with somebody and the guy doesn't give you a phone call, doesn't send a text message. So she is worried, right? What's going to happen next? Because he is our ticket out of this poverty. He is our kinsman redeemer. He is the one that can really, really, truly help us. And so they devise a plan after that. And the plan is outlined in verses 1 through 5. I'll return to the plan in a little bit. But the plan and the strategy comes from Naomi, the older one, to which Ruth responds at the end of verse 5, and she replied after Naomi gives her the plan, all that you say, I will do. She says, I'm gonna get out there. And I think this is important for us to acknowledge and to understand, because we do believe that God is sovereign, that God is at work, and based on what we said about God's providence, that he's using the natural circumstances to accomplish his supernatural will, that God maintains and sustains all of creation. Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke that there hasn't been one day that God has not worked. He works to this day. After Jesus is obviously caught healing on a Sabbath, says God is always at work. If God would to remove his hand from creation, everything would fall apart. So we know that everything happens according to his will and to his purposes. This is a story that reminds us of this truth. But at the same time, we must understand that we are responsible for things in our lives. That God's sovereign will somehow also fits with our responsibility, and God's sovereign will does not excuse us, therefore, of our responsibility. And I think this is, again, something very important for us to acknowledge, because when there are situations in life that are before us and we are encouraged to wait on the Lord, waiting on the Lord does not mean inaction. It does not mean inaction, waiting on the Lord. Waiting on the Lord is a condition of the heart, that you rest that everything is happening because you trust in God's sovereign will, but it shouldn't stop you from making decisions and moving things forward. If you are waiting on the Lord for a new job, hey, wait on the Lord. Trust that God has something good in store for you, but submit your resume. Go to interviews, all right? Get to work. God's sovereignty does not exclude your responsibility. His sovereignty doesn't mean that you should live a life that's not characterized by action. That's what we see here in this story, that at the end of the day, motion should always trump our emotion about how we feel about things. And that's why in the Bible, we have Jesus saying in Luke 18, verse 1, that we should trust that God is in control, but we should pray and not give up on praying. That's why in chapter 7 of the Sermon of the Mount, he says that we should ask, we should seek, and we should find, while in chapter 6, he says, don't worry about anything. Don't be anxious about anything. So trust God as if everything depends on him, but work as if everything also depends on you. So what do we learn? God is at work. Secondly, that God works through us. But then thirdly, God works despite of us. Now let's go back to the advice that Naomi gives to Ruth. Let's go and look at the plan that she outlines for her. And I must admit that it is a strategic and a smart plan, but it's not necessarily a wise plan. So you go back to verse 3. What does she say to her? Okay, here I know. First, before we get to verse 3, she says, I know where he is because the harvest has concluded, and what everyone does when the harvest is concluded is that they celebrate the harvest. They throw a party. And they're there at the threshing floor, which is where they would separate the wheat from the chaff. And all the workers are going to be there, and after they finish that activity and put everything in bags, they're going to party. They're going to eat, they're going to drink, and they're going to sleep right there because that's money for them. The grain was money, and there were thieves, and so they're going to sleep by their profits so that the next day they could commercialize it. But that's where he's going to be. And so I want you to go out there, and she says, I want you therefore to wash yourself and anoint yourself. Because he's used to seeing you dirty and sweaty, working in the fields, all right? And you got to change the perception because a first impression is everything. And so you're going to wash yourself this time. You're going to put on good clothes. You're going to put on perfume. You're going to go out there. And this is what I want you to do next. When you get there, don't go right at him. Let him eat, let him drink, let him catch a buzz. And then when he goes to sleep there by the grain with the others, in the middle of the night, I want you to go to where he's at. So I want you to picture where he's at actually before you go there. So when he lays down, wait a little bit until he falls asleep, and then you go there, and then in the middle of the night, uncover his feet. And when he wakes up, say, what do you want me to do? Now, I have 4 daughters. I would never give any of my daughters this advice. I would never say to my daughters, are you interested in that guy? Dressed to kill. Go to the party, let him drink, catch a buzz with his friends, and when he goes to sleep, uncover him and say, what do you want me to do? Right? I would never ask any of my daughters to do that. I think this is, at best, a very risky advice. And I was thinking, what probably motivated Naomi to come up with this plan and hand it off to Ruth? I actually think that this was motivated by fear, by impatience, that we got to go after this guy. We can't lose this opportunity. And by the grace of God, things turned out well, but it could not have turned out as well as it did. As a matter of fact, there are other moments in the Bible where, other stories in the Bible where we read of similar situations. Remember the story of Abraham? God showed up to Abraham and to his wife Sarah when they were advanced in age and said to them, hey, listen, I'm going to give you a son. I know you guys had a hard time in having a child, but I'm going to give you one day a son, and out of this son, I'm going to build a great nation. And time went on and on and on, and they were growing impatient, and they came up with a plan too. And what was the plan? Sarah came to Abraham and said, hey, I have an idea. I have my maidservant, and maybe you could spend the night with her and get her pregnant, and maybe that's the son that God's been talking about. And they followed through with that plan, and it didn't turn out so well. It's still a problem to this day. There's a story of Moses after he had led the people out of Egypt. People are complaining and of all sorts of things, and they're complaining about thirst, and he talks to God, says the people are thirsty. God says, oh, go to this rock, and I want you to speak to this rock, and As you speak to this rock, water will come out from the rock, and you'll be able to quench the people's thirst. And then he goes there, and what does he do? Because he's filled with anger, because his heart is not in the bright place, he doesn't speak to the rock, but he strikes the rock. Water still comes out, but there are consequences that we will learn later for Moses for doing that. But I think about myself and how many times I have made decisions out of fear, how many times I have taken steps out of anger or anxiety, or even when I lack the trust in God for his provision. Now, the encouraging thing in this story is this, is that even though we all act this way, we all take matters into our own hands, and many times we don't start things right, God still finds a way by his mercy to make it right. Because his grace is greater than our mistakes. His grace is greater than our sins. God still has a way of turning our failures into amazing successes. That's the God we serve. That's the God we find here in this story. Let me tell you another story about another family that was baptized a couple of years ago at one of our churches. There's this lady who was a daughter of a pastor. And, I'm a pastor, and my biggest prayer is that my daughters would marry men of God. And so she begins to date this man who is an agnostic, is European, a good-looking, wealthy man. And her parents say, hey, listen, it's great that he is all those things, but he's not a believer. That's going to become a problem for you later on. And she goes on and she begins life with this man. She lives with him, has a child with him. And after she has this child, she decides to raise this child in the church. And so she goes to this man that she's been living with and she's sharing life with for many years and says, hey, can I take him to church? Says, no. Because Sundays are our family days. On Sundays, we don't do church. We boat. On church, we brunch. On church, we do sports. We don't go to church. And so she grew with this huge sense of disappointment to herself because what she really wanted was to raise her son at the church or in the church in the same way that she was. And because she insisted so much with him, he said something to her. He said, hey, if you can find a church within a mile from our house, I'll go to that church, but I'll only try it once. And so he comes to one of our services, and the son is now a teenager, and the son is the first to come to faith. And he is so moved to see his son come to faith that the gospel had impacted the life of his son, that he begins to come back with his son. And then a month later, he also comes to faith. And then they're having a conversation around the dinner table, and the son says, Dad, you are now a Christian. You have to make it right by mom and by God. He says, what do you mean? You have to marry mom. And so they show up in my office wanting to get married. A few weeks later, I performed their wedding ceremony with their teenage son as the best man, with her father, the pastor, by their side. And then a month later, I baptized him with his son together. Sometimes we don't start things right, but God makes it right. And I want to encourage you here tonight because you may have started a relationship the wrong way. And I want to tell you that there's hope. You may have started a business in a wrong way, but I want to tell you that there's hope. You may have started something else, and you don't know what to do with it. And I want to tell you that there is hope because this is the God that we serve. Because ultimately, the reason for his work is because he loves. God works out of love. And let me tell you something else. You are not that powerful to thwart God's plan for your own life. You can't destroy what God has already designed and prepared for you. You cannot destroy the plans that God has for your spouse, for your children. You cannot mess up God's plan. His sovereign will always wins in the end. And he is at work ultimately because he loves this story, which is now, we're in the last point here. This story points to a greater love story. We've been saying this all the weeks that we've been parking in one of these passages in the book of Ruth. It's pointing to a greater love story. The romance between Boaz and Ruth is a picture of God's love for his people. Boaz is someone that shows up here in the pages of Scripture as a type of Christ. He is a redeemer, like Jesus is, to an outcast bride, which is the church. We do not deserve to be part of God's family, but because of Jesus, we're brought into God's family. The role that Boaz plays in this story is a role that models the role that Jesus plays in our salvation. He is the kinsman redeemer. We said that last week, but I want to say this again, what it means to be a kinsman redeemer in this culture. What was a kinsman redeemer? This was a provision in the Jewish law so that families that went through tragedy would not be wiped out. So if a woman would lose her husband, which was her provider and her protector, that she would still have protection and provision by the closest male to her in that family line. He was supposed to step in to take on the matters of justice in case that husband had been murdered. He was supposed to take on the family name and also buy back the field so that the family would have a place where they can grow crops and also find their sustainability. And here he is. He is just that for Naomi, and he is just that for Ruth. And Ruth's request when she has this conversation with him, it says, I want you to bring me under your wing. Put your cloak over me so that I can receive the benefits that you can give me by being my kinsman redeemer. And immediately here we see the posture and the character of this man. I said last week, and I still stand by what I said, that this man is a godly man. He's an amazing man because she shows up at his bedside in the middle of the night. He does not take advantage of her, and he doesn't want to circumvent the system. In verse 12, remember what he said in verse 12? He says, I'd be glad to do that. I'd be glad to exercise that role, but there's someone else that is closest to me, and if he does not want to redeem you in the morning, I surely will. Unlike, obviously, Ruth and Naomi who are acting out of desperation, he does not cut any corners. He wants to do things right. He's a man that's obedient to the word of God. And obviously, surely in the morning, we're now going into chapter 4, which we'll revisit next week, that closer kinsman redeemer says, I'm not interested. I don't think my wife is going to really like this whole idea. I don't have the means to sustain another field, and so he ends up taking Ruth for a wife. And then we have an insight into his heart. Because Boaz is not interested in increasing his wealth. He's already a wealthy man. He doesn't need another field. What he's truly interested is in Ruth. And that reminds me of this parable that Jesus once told in the Gospel of Matthew that illustrates how the kingdom of God is like. It's a very short parable. And in that parable we read this. This is what we read in that parable. Do we have the text here on the screen? The kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Sound familiar? See, every time that Jesus is telling a parable, he is always putting himself in that parable. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the man who found this treasure in the field, who is willing to sell everything that he has in order to possess this field. It's a picture of Boaz. Boaz is willing to take the field, not for the field's sake, but because he has found this treasure, this love in that field. And that story applies obviously to you and I because it shows how much we are loved by God. The reason why Jesus was willing to give up everything and take off his robe. See, like she is asking Boaz to come under his robe. In the book of Philippians chapter 2, Jesus takes off his royal robe. He is willing to lose everything so that he could possess you and I. This is an important reminder for all of us here because as we go through moments in life where we question whether God is at work or not, we are reminded that on the cross, Jesus went further than Boaz. He lost everything so that he could possess you and I. So that in moments in life when we're questioning whether God is at work in our lives or not, whether he cares about the different areas and aspects of our lives, we can never look up to heaven and say to God, God, you don't love me. Because how can you look at the cross and say that God doesn't love you? God, let me encourage you tonight, is at work in your life.